Sama xel dem ci nit ñu baax ñamu séqaloo.
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you're on the globe. I'd like to welcome you to this AfriHealth webinar being hosted by the Competence-based Education Technical Working Group. As we know, AfriHealth stands for Advancing Professional Excellence in Health, Profession, Education, Research, and Service for Africa. And competence is an important component of this. Competence entails the habitual and judicious use of communication, knowledge, technical skills, clinical reasoning, emotions, values, and reflection in daily practice for the benefit of the individual and the community being served. And this has become the bedrock of training of health workers and is reflected in the shift in training paradigm from traditional methods. This webinar will discuss the basics from global and African perspectives. So it is indeed my pleasure to invite you to sit back and relax and enjoy these fantastic lectures that we're going to present. The first will be by Siobhan Fitzpatrick of the WHO Workforce Department. She will talk about introducing the principles of competency-based education and the WHO Global Competency Framework for Universal Healthcare. So over now to Siobhan, please, for a presentation. Thank you.
Super. Many thanks for that introduction, and many thanks for the invitation to join you today. So I'm just sharing my screen as I've got a few slides that will take us through, double checking that I am sharing the right screen. Edisola, if you could let me know, it looks slightly different from my side.
Okay.
Okay, great.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, super. I'll continue. So competency-based education is very much part of the strategy that WHO recommends for strengthening health worker education with a view to strengthening the workforce. So a couple of the key documents that we refer to within the World Health Organization, the global strategy for addressing the Sustainable Development Goals for strengthening the workforce by 2030. This was published in 2016, and this very much sets out the recommendations for optimizing investment in education and in employment. We also have just had a resolution passed by the World Health Assembly. This was last summer, but the final documents, the policy briefs and so on, have just been published earlier this year. And these again very much talk about that journey towards investment and very much seeing education and employment as that spectrum. So when we're talking about training health workers, we very much need to think about the employment markets, the systems in which they will practice at the end of it. So very much thinking about education and employment in the round. And this is really special for competency-based education. It's a whole of program approach, but rather than starting from what do you need to know, this starts from what do we need people to be able to do? What is the health system in which they practice? Then working backwards, so where do they need to be at different points in their training? And then from that, what needs to be in the curricula? What is the knowledge? What are the skills? What are the learning experiences in order to train people and support them to achieve those education outcomes? So competency-based education has been around for many decades. So the first reference that we're aware of is in 1978. And this was actually a WHO publication. So that's the screenshot. You can see the middle of the slides. But of course, before it was adopted within the health professions, this has very much been the approach to education and training across many vocations, industry in many different countries. So it's not a new thing, but we recognize that it has been embraced in different countries at different stages. So it is perhaps new in some areas. So the Lancet Commission in 2010 and the more recent update to that commission again calls for strengthening of education, including competency-based training, amongst other approaches into professional education, problem-based learning. These are all friends, as it were. It's not mutually exclusive, but they all come together as different educational approaches. So competency-based education, we think of this as a whole of program approach. It's not just thinking about the outcomes of education, but actually the journey for learners to develop those competencies for practice. So the model that we sometimes refer to, the ICBME, the International Collaborators of Competency-Based Medical Education, have identified 5 core components. So the competency-based outcomes of education, the sequence progression, so taking the learner through the acquisition of knowledge, the application of knowledge, and also different learning journeys, so perhaps with more or less supervision, the learning experiences and assessment of those outcomes. And sort of why do we recommend this? It is associated with better preparedness for practice. It's a more efficient approach for structuring the curricula, for identifying the content of the curricula, but it's also deemed to be more relevant by learners, by faculty, by patients, because you can directly associate what you're learning, why you're learning it, with what you will do on course completion. So just a couple more slides of theory, and then I will also share the work that WHO has done in this area. So one of the things that we think is really important when we're thinking about competency-based education is that holistic approach to competence. So competence is the person who is ready for practice, that minimum state of proficiency. And the competencies, it's a very similar term, but it is an important difference. The competencies are the person's attributes that enable that performance. So we need to think about what it is that somebody does, the activities of health practice, the tasks, the skills, the services that they will provide. But we know that health is not a checklist. There is no such thing as the standard patient. Everybody comes in with slightly different needs, different presentations, different contexts. So we need to be able to adapt to the person or the community in front of us, to the teams we're working in, to the availability of resources. And this is going to look different in every context. So we need the competencies to be able to adapt, to be able to make decisions, to be able to respond to the challenges in front of us. So we think of both the practice activities, the what needs to be done, and the competencies of the person to do it. And we need that double approach to competence when we're thinking about how we design the education programs to enable people to provide quality health services. This does not overlook the importance of knowledge, but it roots knowledge in the context of why do we need to know what we need to know? It's because it's what do we do with that knowledge in practice. Constructive alignment is something which you will see again and again in the design of programs. So it's not just labeling the outcomes of an education program as competencies, but also thinking about how the learner will develop those competencies and how those competencies will be assessed. So very much thinking about that triangle of outcomes, learning experiences, and assessment. And this is where approaches like problem-based learning or clinical experience are really important, because you're not learning in the classroom, but you're learning in the contexts in which you will be practicing. Assessment of outcomes is obviously essential when it comes to the health professions, readiness for practice, and at what point an individual can graduate and is ready to treat patients. So we need to ensure that we're assessing the right things. MCQs are assessing knowledge, but we also need to ensure that we're assessing, can somebody do the things that they need to do in practice? So it's important to match the assessment formats with the outcomes to be assessed. Last slide of theory. Thank you for bearing with me. So when we talk about competence, so this is the minimum graduating standard from a learning program and the expectations for practice. And this will differ at different stages in the learning journey. So we need to define that standard in terms of the supervision, in terms of the expected level of practice. But we recognize there are different pathways to competence and that learning continues in practice. So we think about that dynamic journey as competencies on the continuum, but really trying to ensure that minimum standard So it's that focus on outcomes of education. When we think of certification, of course, of health workers, this is quite often attached to a license, which is a yes/no decision, rather than being able to differentiate perhaps between excellent and very good. We want everybody to be very good. So it's ensuring that minimum standard is what we need for practice. So what WHO has been doing in this space, last year we published a framework which embraces all of those principles I've just spoken to on competency-based education and really takes you through that journey of program design, defining the outcomes relevant for practice according to scope of practice, the services the health needs in a particular area. But we've also identified through that work the essential competencies for all health workers. And we found a lot of commonality between everyone from community health workers, physician assistants, nurses, medical practitioners. And these competencies are on the screen now. They relate to people-centeredness, evidence-based practice, effective communication, collaboration. So everyone working in healthcare needs to have these competencies in order to do their job, in order to practice, in order to care for individuals and communities. And you will find examples in this framework around what does this look like in practice? What does effective communication involve? How do we know if somebody is competent? And you will find this all the detail in the framework. So you can see the competencies and then the behaviors that demonstrate those competencies in practice. The practice activities, this is very much a principles document. So it's guiding you to define the outcomes of education for the person. So there is no expectation that one individual would be able to provide the range of health services across individual health, population health, and the management and organization responsibilities. But it does guide you to think about which ones of these might be within scope of practice. So we often see in scopes of practice documents, curricular documents, about the specific interventions or elements of healthcare to be provided. But it's also important to ensure documentation, handover with other members of the team. And we found that some of these were sometimes overlooked in curricular design. And we wished to highlight the importance of training across all of these areas, because it's at any one of these stages that the quality of care might not happen because of an oversight in one of these areas. So it's important to think about the full range. Okay, I'll continue, of different outcomes for an education program. Within the framework, you can identify sort of the different knowledge areas and some of the illustrative profiles, which can then help to tailor those practice activities to a specific context. Thinking there is a fourth chapter in the framework. So we talk about the competencies, the principles of education, and the practice activities. And there is also guidance around programmatic design. So again, going back to my earlier slides, we talked about whole of program approach to competency-based education. And this is really then thinking about how do you identify clinical experiences? Do you have enough faculty? Do they need training? What are the resources involving the community at the different stages? So very much thinking about that whole of program design. We assume that the decisions around what goes in the scope of practice or a set of services have been defined. And then the framework is very useful for then guiding the curricular strengthening design and looking at existing content to perhaps reorganize or identify different areas of overlap or redundancy within the program. So it's very much a principles framework for adaptation to different contexts. And these are just some of the tools that you will find in that framework. Skip over that one actually. So I think just the key messages of the competency framework that WHO has published is very much that holistic approach to competence, that we need to think about both what somebody does and how they do it, but also using this model as a lens through which to interpret other content. So this is not the only reference that you would need to sort of review curricula and ensure that that the approach is comprehensive, but it is helpful when looking at other reference documents, for example, those published by the professional associations, and to start questioning, is this a skill? Is this knowledge? How would I learn this? How would I assess that? But I think it is important to look at that reference for the competencies that are relevant for all health workers. So WHO, I'm in the headquarters, the Health Workforce Department, and we very much look to identify good practice, to share the guidance and the principles of competency-based education. But we do have colleagues who are working in the different regional offices, so the Afro region, as well as in 150 countries worldwide. So you can always ask for technical assistance in strengthening education. Of course, a lot of what I have spoken to today is very much the ideal endpoint, but rather than aiming for that straight away, I guess there's also the journey of identifying the stepping stones and what are the incremental changes that can be made in curricular design. So these are some of the different areas that WHO colleagues in the country offices, in the regional offices can provide support, and also some of the additional references going beyond that global framework, but also some of the competency frameworks that have been developed within the Africa region that will also provide useful references. I'll be happy to take questions after we hear from our second speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellent. Now I'm in organization.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Okay, thank you. I've been introduced, Sarah Chiguli from Makerere University. I'm going to give the experiences we've had at Makerere University College of Health Sciences. I decided to narrow down the presentation to fit in the time, and I'm very grateful to the first presenter because she has defined competencies and she has really made it easier for me to share my journey. I'm trying to, okay. So this slide was supposed to show us what competence-based education is, and it was well defined in the first session. So I'll go straight to describing what Makerere University is and how our journey of competence-based education has been. So Makerere is the oldest university in East Africa, one of the oldest, but also is the oldest, the medical school is the oldest medical school in East and Central Africa, over 100 years. And we've had change in health professions education for the last 20 years. Actually, it was a transformation. We started way back in the early 2000s, and we are still struggling to really understand and also do the best in this context. So we continue to transform our education with institutional and instructional strategies, including the implementation of competence-based education. So how did we start? As I said, we started at the medical school in 1922, and many years afterwards, in 2000, the university started innovations with a goal of producing graduates who would be able to address the population needs in a decentralized system. It was found that many graduates were training in the center at the university, and yet the graduates were supposed to work out in the community, in the districts, and many were not able to cope. So we said, okay, we need to see what we can do so that the graduates are able to cope. And at the medical school, the processes of innovation started with the leadership engaging faculty and other stakeholders to identify the needs of the population and gaps in our training and our curriculum. So we identify the needs of the patients, the needs of the communities, and also we're able to identify the gaps that the people who had been trained at Makerere had. We were one medical school for a long time. So many of the old or the existing graduates, the doctors, now I'm specific, we are from the university. So we're able to identify the gaps, but also the gaps within our curriculum. And this resulted into a curriculum review and transformation of learning. At that time, we changed the process to problem-based learning from the traditional lecture-based mainly, and also community-based education and service, among other changes. At that time, key competencies among graduates were used in the design, the desired competencies among the graduates. At this needs assessment, we were told that our graduates had challenges with problem-solving skills, lifelong learning skills, leadership skills, communication, and some areas of the clinical skills, although their clinical skills were quite robust. There were also some challenges in the managerial skills, teamwork skills. So the change that was made, the curriculum revision tried to address the gaps needed to make the graduates be able to work with the communities, with the patients, and address their problems. And we adopted a student-centered, problem-based, integrated curriculum with community-based education and practice with an active period, and everything was systematically planned in order to address the gaps. And this was published way back in 2006, the change process. So after 6 years of implementation in 2008, we did another situation analysis to find out what the situation of teaching and learning among medicine and nursing students was, and still with a view or with the aim of understanding where we are in our journey of transformation, so that we can produce graduates who are able to serve their communities better. The key findings were as follows: relevant content. We had a variety of learning experiences, but still we had some gaps in those competencies above. And we also realized that there was inadequate continuous faculty development to support some of the teaching and learning activities, and also inadequate mechanism for continuous quality improvement at the medical school. So at that time, we adopted a competence-based model of curriculum design. It came out that we needed to adopt the competence-based model. It was around 2010, and we looked around at a number of frameworks, and we adopted, I think, the American Medical Association's framework that had those domains. And then these were the domains that we used with some sub-competencies under each domain when we are designing the new curriculum between 2018 to 2010 after the needs assessment. This emphasized clinical skills, interpersonal communication skills, leadership and management, and everything that you see up there. So we had to align the learning outcomes, the desired competencies and the learning outcomes to the learning activities and the assessment. I think the previous speaker stressed this. and we base this on principles of adult learning. We emphasize student-centered learning still, interprofessional education, the community-based education. We thought that some of the competencies would be acquired in learning environments outside the teaching hospital in the center of town. And we try to align assessment to the outcomes or to the competencies. So we did constructive alignment, or we tried to do our best at that time. And we published this process. We have a publication in 2014 speaking to this, as you can see, competence-based education into sub-Saharan African medical schools. More recently, we did another study to evaluate how the assessment was aligned to the competencies, and this has also been published recently. And we do all this so that we can identify gaps that can help us to continuously improve what we are doing. So the latest study that I showed you, the publication, was to evaluate whether assessment methods within the curriculum, the medical curriculum, address the stated competencies. We have 9 domains and about 59 sub-competencies. And the conclusion was that competence medical education was successfully implemented. There was evidence of assessment of the 59 competencies within the curriculum or the implementation. The faculty were aware, but they indicated the need for more training in competence-based education to better implement competence-based education. And I would say they need more training in the concept of competence-based education. So we had challenges in the implementation of competence-based education. The system in place for sustaining innovations. The system is based on departments, preclinical, clinical, and I think this is not the best system for sustaining or for implementing innovations such as competence-based education. We need a system where we plan together, where we know what competencies are learned at the different places in time, and assessment that tries to assess competences that build, that students acquire in their process. The leadership can also be a challenge. With continuous change in leadership, we need to be on top of the game, because sometimes there are changes that may not be in the best, that might drive us. Many of us, we are trained in the traditional preclinical, clinical, and when you see something which is new, but which also requires more resources and more effort, it may not make sense. I talked about the coordination. We need the coordination. We don't have medical education units or centers or departments which can help us, although we have requested the university to do this, and our submission has been at the University Senate for some time. So we have few faculty with education expertise to implement, to drive, and make sure that the changes are continuous. And we need a lot of faculty development. That's why we need the system, we need the coordination, and we need to continuously monitor and evaluate what we're doing. And this can also be a challenge. Quality assurance, what standards, the university standards don't general, and sometimes they don't address our specific needs in health professions education. Lastly, the large student numbers over the last few years, the learning environment, the teaching hospital being in that center, which makes it difficult for the students to learn what they need to do when they graduate, because they need to learn in different environments, and the community-based education more or less takes care of it, but still it's a challenge. So moving forward, We want to see that you utilize online training to enhance competence-based education and student-centered learning. I was very excited to read the WHO Global the framework, competence framework, and I said, oh my God, this is almost similar, a summary of what we've tried to do. And I think we'll be able to look at them and adopt and adapt them to see how to improve as we go along. And we need to also have other instructional and institutional strategies. I talked about the education units, but also training faculty, having collaborations and partnerships. We've all been told that WHO offices can be a good partner for us as we build our skills to implement CBE. We need better coordination, hence the units or centers. Faculty development, I can't overemphasize this. And we need to do research to generate local evidence to guide what we are doing. Research that we need to generate in the African context, which will guide us, but also to share our stories. And there's a need to recognize scholarship of teaching and learning, because many of us who are involved in these education innovations, we are not employed to do this. We are employed. I'm personal a pediatrician. And therefore, when I go into health professions education, it's beyond, but also it may not be recognized as something very important, and indeed it is. So we need to recognize the scholarship of teaching and learning. So in short, this one's difficult to see, but we have a happy project, which was designed around trying to produce graduates that can address the needs of the health system, so that the education reforms strengthen the health system, so that we have improved health. And we are trying to implement institutional and instructional changes that are able to achieve these outcomes. And competencies, as you can see, is one of the things that we defined and which we are continuously engaged in as we move in the next 20 years of competence-based education at Makerere University. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Professor. Now, my body lectures, and I will now questions. I will video and they will follow you. And then the questions in the box. Then there's a question. There's a question.
Hello, Prof. We can hardly hear you. No, you are still not clear.
System.
Yes. Can you get somebody to check that for you? Because it's not very clear. But as you indicated, I think they can post the questions in the chat so that the speakers can pick them, the questions or the comments in the chat. Somebody is recommending that you can leave and come back. Maybe it might be better. Hello, colleagues. Whilst we wait for Prof to sort out his microphone, I think we can continue with the discussion from where our second speaker has just ended. So if you have any questions, please post in the chat, or if you want to raise your hand, please feel free, unmute, and then make your comments. So we want
Is
to...
my audio clear now?
Yes, yes.
Is it better
yes,
now?
Prof. Yes, Prof, please take over. It's
It
better
is.
now.
Okay.
Yes.
No. There was a question there that I missed. I guess I won't be able to go back to that question for Sarah. Maybe we should go, maybe I can ask Siobhan this one. You mentioned supervision, which is necessary to ensure that the competencies are acquired. But how do you accomplish this in the face of limited manpower? And the second one that I'll ask you to address, please, is to talk about what tools can be used for programmatic assessment as part of core components of competency-based education. So if Siobhan can take these two questions, while we wait for other questions and comments, other chat, please. Thank you.
Super, absolutely. And I think this is one of the biggest challenges that we can identify with the implementation of competency-based education is it does require more faculty and closer supervision. So I guess there are two ways of looking at how do you increase the availability of trained supervisors. And some of that will be through the university or the education institution, but others of it will be in partnership with the clinical sites. And actually, are there ways of training clinicians to provide that supervision? And it is a specific skill set which does require specific training, but it doesn't necessarily require everybody to be expert in setting assessments, for example. So I think it's looking very much at how the training can be provided. And in fact, this is a question I would love to bring Sarah into. Sarah, you very much talk to the importance of faculty driving the journey and being sort of co-owners of that journey. But I would be very much interested in your experience of collaborating with the clinical institutions and how you ensured the training opportunities for your students. The second question, before I pass the microphone back to Sarah, in terms of programmatic assessment. So I think there are lots of different ways that you could look at this, and we've got a few useful references in the Global Competency Framework. I'll pop the reference in the chat, but it's looking at the student's perspective, faculty's perspective, but also looking at the health outcomes, which obviously that won't be immediately apparent, but tracking the impact, because of course any investment in education is an immense investment. That's why we care so much about the effectiveness of the training provided. It's an investment both in population health, it's an investment by the individuals themselves, the learners, but it's also usually heavily subsidized by governments and so on. So I think it's important to look at all of the different sources of information, and there is a specific table that I will signpost you to when I drop the reference into the chat box. I wonder, Sarah, if you might like to expand on what I started to touch on in that first question about supervision and faculty.
Thank you very much. Yes, supervision and faculty, and yes, you would need a lot of or many faculty members, but who are also trained, who know what the curriculum is all about, who know what competencies are needed at the different levels, because the journey needs to start earlier on to allow the students to really understand what they're learning, even in the first year, will fit in when they graduate. So some of these application or the competencies start earlier on. So you need faculty from the medical school, but also from the teaching hospitals and other clinical sites. And we use the clinicians in the teaching hospital. They're part of our teaching program, our training program. Over the past few years, we've had some challenges with the university and the teaching hospital, which is under the Ministry of Education, drifting apart. But we need the planning to start right from the Ministry of Health, so that all of us are working towards the same goal. But we have the cooperation of these. We also, when our students go out into the community, we use the clinicians, the doctors at the clinical sites. We use the nurses, we use the clinical officers, because some of the things, some of the tasks they do, and some of the things they learn can be supervised by these people, although they may not really be university employees or even qualified to be faculty, but we have them, and the university knows that we use people across the health system to supervise the students. The challenge of the big numbers, but also challenge of not having even enough numbers of these people if the students are many. So it needs a lot of planning, but we need all the human resources across the spectrum of health facilities to supervise and to help these students acquire the competencies. Thank you. And someone asked me about
Thank you, Sarah. There are a couple of questions in the chat box that I think we can quickly go over. And so relatedly, what are the monitoring mechanisms and tools for the competency-based education, especially in resource-limited settings? That's from John Mukisa.
So the tools, maybe I can say what we've been able to do or to use. We've got feedback from the faculty, from the students, and we've also adopted some tools used by our colleagues across the continents, because the adoption of the competencies was also from there. So it is really easy to say that this is the competency that you identified. How are you able to monitor the learning? How are you able to monitor that is being assessed and that the graduates are able to acquire that? So, but because we don't have dedicated education units and people to be there to do this, sometimes it's not as easily done as said, and that's why we need some structures in place to help us do this. But we've been able to adopt tools from other areas to see that we are able to monitor the inputs, the processes, and the outcomes. The easiest is the summative exam to see. Sorry.
Okay. We seem to have lost Professor Kiguli now. The next question is also for her, to ask about the situation analysis that she reported on. How was it done? Was it through document reviews, institutional memory, or through interviews? I'm not sure. Oh, she's back on now.
I'm on.
Oh, okay. So it's a question for you as well from Joyce Siwila to explain how your situation analysis was done. Was it through document reviews, institutional memory, or through interviews?
It was through a number of methods. Yes, we reviewed the documents to try and see what was in the curriculum, what competencies. We looked at the learning methods and the evidence that above the methods that were used and the assessment. We interviewed stakeholders within the university itself, the faculty, the leadership, the students. We also interviewed stakeholders outside the university, the people who employ our students, the district health officials, and other people who are supervising our students, our graduates. So we used a number of methods to arrive at the conclusion. Hello, Chair. Colleagues, can you hear me?
Hi, Sarah. Yes, I
Yes.
can hear you, but I think we
Yeah,
did
we can
lose
hear
our
you.
chair.
Okay. There's a question. Do you still see a need for the traditional mode of objectives assessment in preclinical education? I think it is for all of us. So maybe someone can address that.
Sure, I can start us off on this question if that's helpful. So certainly I find it helpful working with objectives because it helps me structure the different units of learning. So I can then think about the progression through a program. So you might start with sort of the knowledge objectives, and then it might be sort of more problem-based outcomes. But when we come to think about assessment, fundamentally, the progression decisions from a program will be looking not at the knowledge objectives, but at what somebody does in practice. So what I was talking about, the practice activities and the competency-based practice activities. So if your summative assessment, so assessment of learning, is focused on the outcomes, the broader picture of the outcomes. But certainly I find the use of objectives is very helpful to guide learners and faculty, both in terms of the structure of the curricula and the learning journey, but also for formative assessment, so assessment for learning and to identify different learning needs along the way. Over.
I don't know if I've got the question well. The objective assessment objectives, is it the, I don't know, but I think it's still needed, especially because we are working in institutions that have their policies where learning is structured across students learning certain things or having certain outcomes over some period of time. So I think we still need to use it, but we'd use learning outcomes even when we are talking about the knowledge objectives. We use what they should be able to define, or what they should be able to, how they should be able to apply the knowledge and all that, even in the preclinical education. And it is important to try to integrate some of the outcomes even in the preclinical education, so that when they're learning something about the need, the reflexes and all that, then they can have some outcomes, some tasks which help them apply the knowledge and the skills learned. Thank you. We lost our chairperson, so I don't know how we should move. We still have some 9 minutes or so. I don't know if any of the people on the audience has a question or an experience to share regarding the topic of discussion today. Because we're a number. Yes, Pascal.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Absolutely. I have 2 questions, if you don't mind. The first one is for Ms. Fitzpatrick. When it comes to the WHO guidance document, there seems to be a lot of work that was done in parallel to that guidance document, which was published in 2016, as you mentioned. Do you have any, example of successful initiation, execution of that guidance document? That was for Ms. Fitzpatrick. For Professor Kugali, my question is, it seems like you had quite a bit of identification of opportunities for growth, but if you had one lesson learned from your experience, what would that be? I know there's a lot, but I'm asking for 1 or 2, if it's not possible to just have one. Over. Thank you.
Sure, I'll respond to that first question. So I think just double checking which document you're referring to. The 2016 publication was the Global Strategy for Health Workforce Strengthening. So that encompasses regulation, education, employment, social accountability. And the competency framework, which I presented, was published just last year. So in terms of the implementation of the competency framework, or essentially the implementation of competency-based education and using those principles, we are in discussion with a number of countries, particularly in the Southeast Asia region, around strengthening the education. But the only examples of full implementation in the last, I think it's 10 months, relate to short courses. So we have adopted that model within the WHO Academy, which is the provision of lifelong learning. And this is, again, it's that approach of, so rather than starting from here is a WHO guideline and we want everyone to know about it, but actually different people will use that guideline differently. So orienting the learning program design to what people's roles are, and actually that is different for clinical practitioners, to administrators, to others working in the health system. So the Academy is not yet fully launched. So it is very difficult for us to track the impact as yet if we think about the Kirkpatrick model, but certainly, yes, it is being adopted and it is being referenced alongside other strategies for strengthening education. Over.
Okay, thank you. What 1 or 2 things have I learned? I think the need for stakeholder engagement in these innovations in implementing competence-based education. As someone said, it's a process, and also the students are being supervised by many people as they go across, and we may not have enough faculty to do this. So we need to engage everyone right from the policymakers, the ministries, so that there's conversation and understanding between health and education. In Uganda, there's a fight. The schools should be under health, not under education and all that. But also when you go to the medical schools and the teaching hospital, we need to work together to understand, but also within the medical schools, we need to work together, to learn together, so that we all know what each person is doing. We have many silos. I'm from pediatrics, I'm from anatomy. That's how the university is structured, but we need to move beyond so that we all understand what competence-based education is and how someone can learn through the process and their competence change along. So I think that is really important. The need for faculty development. We need leaders in education in the African region at the different institutions who are master in this area of health professions education, who can take up the leadership role of design, of training others, but also we need to continuously train faculty and identify new leaders as we go along. At Macquarie, we have a program of the masters, but also some short programs. These need to be continuous because we need, and everyone needs to have the knowledge and the skills to implement not only competence-based education, but other innovations that that are required to produce a competent person. And lastly, the need of the leadership, the leaders that can support and sustain many of these innovations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You all agree with me that we've had a wonderful afternoon, and we're going to bring this webinar to a close. There's a last question there that asked about what are the weaknesses of competence-based education or curriculum. I don't know if there's any quick answer to that before we finally call it a day. Any quick answer to that? Weakness of the competence-based assessment in low-income countries and how to cope with them?
I think it needs a lot of resources. I would not say that it's the
Okay.
weakness of the competence-based education, but where we are now,
Okay.
many of us are tuned to the traditional way of teaching and learning, our silos, but also the policies require everyone to be in a certain course, a certain program for a certain amount of time. So because it requires the resources, the understanding, and it's a move, I think I wouldn't say that it's a weakness, but we need to understand it, because many times people have said, you know, we need to go back to the old system where we taught, where we had this and this and this, instead of trying to understand what this is and how to move as we go along.
Hello.
Yeah,
Can you
thank
hear
you.
me?
Yes,
Can you
we
hear
heard
me?
you. Yes, we heard you, and very good
Okay.
information. Thank you so
No.
much. Thank
This
you.
is another person. Hello, can you hear me? Hello.
Yes, Belinda, we can
Hello?
hear you.
Hello.
We can
Yes.
hear you, Belinda.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is Belinda from Malawi, Kamuzu University of Earth Sciences. I also just want to agree with the previous speaker to say, we can't really say that those are challenges, but I think what we need is to have a mindset change. You know, things are changing, we also need to change. Yes, there might be some hiccups here and there, but let's embrace them and also use critical thinking to come up with solutions to these things. Otherwise, if we go back to the old methods, they've proved that they also have some shortfalls. So moving forward, I would advocate that as leaders, mindset change, very, very important. Yes, some will still lag behind, but I think those that are positive, let's pull them along and do what we can. CPDs are also very, very important, but otherwise I've learned a lot and I want to learn more so that I can also convince people so that we really move towards the competence-based learning. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Belinda. I'll have to bring the session to a close now. Let me start by thanking our fabulous speakers, Siobhan Fitzpatrick and Sarah Kuguli, for wonderful presentations. I'd like to thank the audience for your participation. And I'd like to thank AfriHealth for giving us a platform to bring this webinar. This is the first in a series of webinars that this TWG will be organizing. And I hope when we invite you for the next one, you'll participate. Please remember to fill the evaluation form, and we want more members to join us. On behalf of AfriHealth, I'd like to thank you for participating, and I wish you a wonderful day. Best wishes and God bless. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Happy Women's Day.
Thank you. Happy Women's